Good evening, and welcome to the Central Library. I'm Carla Hayden, CEO of the Enoch Pratt Free Library in Baltimore. We're very, very pleased to have all of you here tonight for this special evening. And we just want to say a special hello to C-SPAN's Book TV viewers who might be tuning in. When we originally booked Manning Marable several months ago, we were, as you can imagine, very excited to have him here in Baltimore and to hear him discuss his much anticipated landmark book, Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention. We were so heartbroken when we heard that he became ill and then later passed away, just days before that monumental book was released. But we still wanted to honor him and his work, and definitely his life. So thanks to a lifelong Pratt Library supporter and our board member, Marc Steiner, we arrived at this event tonight. And we are really honored to have the people we have on our panel tonight. We know it's going to be a great tribute to a great man. But before we get started, we have a very special guest here who we want to invite to come up to say a few words. Manning Marable's stepdaughter, Aliyah Tyner.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
On behalf of my stepfather and the rest of my family, I'd like to welcome you to this wonderful event. I'm happy to see so many of you here to honor him and his legacy. He too would be pleased to know how many people cared about him, found inspiration in his work, and found truth in his scholarship. For Manning, his last project was a 10-year labor of love. When I had the time to go back to New York, my first question to Manning was about his health, and the second was, how is Malcolm? He would share with us the latest interview or archival discovery with such admiration in his voice. You couldn't help to be as excited as he was about everything. It so disappoints me that he did not make it here to see his book enter our lives, but he finished it. And while we have to read it without him, he would be happy that we can, at least, do that. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate you being here tonight with us. And now I'd like to introduce the moderator of tonight's tribute. Many of you hear him every day on WEAA radio. He's part of the Pratt Library family, and he is one of our most active board members. Please welcome Mr. Marc Steiner.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'm glad you all showed up for this evening. This is very important. Just to add on to what our leader of the library said, Carla Hayden, when we realized, obviously, that Manning Marable passed, somebody I knew in passing, but was a great human being, interesting intellect, powerful thinker, we decided that we couldn't just let the day go, and we needed to gather a panel together to talk about this work. And for me, it was especially important. Malcolm X was a figure that is somebody that we will talk about him from this book. That, you know, there's very few people on the planet Earth who have a postage stamp in both Iran, honoring him both in Iran and the United States of America. So that juxtaposition says a lot about the juxtaposition of Malcolm X and the power and pain of his legacy that people wrestle over all the time. And for me, when Manning passed away, and I called Carla right away to say we need to continue this with the panel that we came up with, is because as a young man of 18 years old when Malcolm X was assassinated, I jumped on a Greyhound bus to go to New York to stand outside the church at his funeral, and was among the thousands and thousands, the most amazing day to see thousands of people standing there as Malcolm was driven to the cemetery for his last walk. And this book, some call a magnum opus, some call a tragedy, some think it destroys his legacy, other things it makes his legacy even larger and greater. So we're going to discuss that tonight. I want you to know there's a microphone there, and at some point during these next 2 hours, at least by the second hour, if not earlier, we will invite people to come up and to join this conversation at the mic. And asking this one thing, though, since there's so many people here, and we have a panel with lots to say, that you don't go to the microphone and give a lengthy 10, 15-minute discourse, but join the conversation. We have with us Sherrilyn Ifill, who is an assistant professor of law at the University of Maryland School of Law, also chairman of the OSI board.
I know, right?
Next to her, Eric Dyson, University Professor of Sociology at Georgetown University and host of the Eric Dyson Show that you hear on WEAA and across the nation. Lester Spence, that's where the assistant came from, a professor of political science and Africana studies at Hopkins University. Melissa Harris Perry, associate professor of politics and African American studies, Princeton, but now Tulane University. So let's jump into the heat of the battle and talk about the significance of this book and the argument around the significance of this book. Clearly, it's adding something huge to this discussion. But what is it? I mean, I wrestled with this book reading through it twice. But before I throw out some of those ideas to see if you agree or disagree, I'm just curious, going through the panel, starting with Sherrilyn Ifill, what is for you the historical significance of Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention?
Thank you, Mark. Well, first of all, the significance, of course, is that Manning Marable wrote it, and that Marable himself really represents an example for many of us who became scholars, who entered the academy, of how one can live as a relevant scholar, a scholar who's relevant to the lives of African American people, who is focused on bringing truth in great detail. This is my kind of book, 80 pages of footnotes. I love it. And I remember that the night that the news came out that Manning Marable had passed away, I was in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I've never been before, but giving a talk about slavery and reparations at University of Michigan. And the woman who was hosting me was the person who told me about it. She teaches at University of Michigan in the law school and in the Afro-American Studies department, white woman, and she immediately began to tell me about how Manning Marable had mentored her as a young scholar in New York. And I didn't find this surprising that I was somewhere in the heartland and somebody was telling me this story because of his tremendous reach and influence. The seeds that he planted as a mentor are just extraordinary. So I don't want to, before we jump right into talking about Malcolm X, the book, really want to say that for me, a good deal of the significance is that he wrote it. I would secondly say it's also significant that unfortunately he died before the book was released, but that this evening and others like it are so important. I can remember when the mother of Emmett Till died. She also had a book that she had written, and she died a week before the book came out. And most of you have probably never read the book because, of course, she wasn't alive to do the publicity. It's a powerfully important book. It's about what happens to mothers. It's about the journey of a mother when her son is killed, something very powerful for the African American community. So I just want to say tonight is also really important, and it's our job to carry this forward. In terms of the significance, very briefly then for me, I actually think that this book is in some ways long overdue because it provides missing details that in your intellectual spirit and in your spirit, you just know have to be missing from what you know, those of us who were not, did not personally know Malcolm X or know people who personally knew him, that were missing from the story. And that is really the day-to-day struggle of what it takes to evolve as a leader, particularly as an African-American male leader who has integrity. It is a journey. It is not a place. And there have been so many pieces of Malcolm's journey that are missing. They've been filled in for King in many different works and in many different ways. But I've always found these huge gaps in terms of Malcolm X's journey, and many of them are filled by this book, and they're really important because of the iconic position that he holds for so many, and I'm sure we can talk about more of this later. I'll stop there.
Michael Eric Dyson, who also wrote a blurb